So this recording is about Descartes and the dream argument, preparing for our discussion of the matrix. Descartes is called the father of modern philosophy because he was the first philosopher to try to deal with the new methodology of science and its implications for how we see the world and how human nature fits into the world that's revealed by science. So, it may help to remind a little bit what problems the new scientific view of reality is going to cause. It's basically going to establish what we call the mind's eye model, a return to Plato's idea that what we perceive is merely a virtual reality, that we don't perceive reality directly. Instead, we perceive the effects that objects produce on our senses and the images that our brain creates on the basis of those images. So we had seen that the scientific revolution was based upon the two principles of separating the relative and the absolute and purifying the appearances, so that science began from the assumption that you just can't trust the senses. Aristotle's view trusted the senses and came up with all the wrong conclusions because the senses deceive us, just as Plato had said, because what we perceive is merely relative to us, and what we see is a combination of many causes rather than the forms existing purely. And we saw that resulted in the distinction between primary and secondary properties in Galileo, and Descartes and all the other rest of the modern philosophers will reduplicate this. And this was the idea that the real properties of objects were the scientific mathematical properties, like the properties of molecules and atoms, like size, extension, and length. Those affected our senses, and all we perceived directly were the secondary qualities, or the feelings, the experiences that existed in our mind. So Descartes is going to be the first philosopher to recognize that view of how our senses work not only makes science possible, but also is going to create significant problems figuring out how knowledge is possible, and is going to create a new view of the self and its relationship to the natural world that will challenge some of the truths of religion. So the mind's eye model says that what we are is essentially a ghost, or a mind's eye, a soul, or a spirit that's watching a virtual reality, watching a set of pictures on a TV screen. So that soul is sitting inside of its mind, watching the images that show up on our mental TV screen from the input that comes from the senses. So all of Descartes' philosophy and all of the philosophy that follows is going to be seeing what consequences this new mind's eye model of the self is. And we'll see it's going to give rise to a new view of what a human individual is as a radically individual, subjective being, an island of subjectivity, we'll say. So Descartes is going to want to really do two different things in the meditations that we're reading. He wants to defend science and show that it really isn't a threat to Christianity. He was alive during the time that Galileo was brought before the Inquisition. In fact, withdrew some of his work that he was about to publish when that happened. So he was profoundly affected by that and wanted his work to be seen as not threatening to religion. But he also wanted to show that the new scientific method, based on Platonic methods, based on the mind, was more certain than the older Aristotelian method based upon the senses. So he wants to show how the scientific method works and provide a foundation for scientific method in the mind, but not in the senses. And probably more importantly, he wants to show how science and religion can be compatible, how the new view of nature revealed by science isn't really as threatening to religion as many religious thinkers at his time and still today might think. The way he's going to do that might not seem obvious. We're going to read his first argument, the dream argument, which is going to be an argument that we can't tell whether we're dreaming or not. We can't tell whether any of the truths that we know are true or not. But Descartes' method isn't going to be skeptical. In fact, his method of doubt is aiming at, first of all, reducing all of the shaky foundations for our knowledge. He compares it to having a house that has a bunch that's old and has shaky foundations. You might demolish all of the ones that are rickety and might fall down, and then rebuild your knowledge upon firm foundations. So don't be deceived. Descartes, in the first meditation, is showing how all of the knowledge we get from our senses is open to doubt, and how if all we had to go on was our senses, then we wouldn't know anything. We'll see how in Meditation 3 next time, how he starts rebuilding up all of our knowledge and ultimately comes to the conclusion that what science tells us is true, and we can be certain that it's true, but based upon the contents of our mind, not upon any information that we're getting from the senses. So don't be deceived, and on the quiz, if I ask you, Descartes believes that we can't tell whether we're dreaming and that none of our knowledge of the external world is true, you're going to mark that as false, because even though that's what he's arguing on the basis of the senses, he thinks we have another access to knowledge that comes only from our mind that we'll get next time when we start looking at Meditation 3 and the rest of the meditations. So the dream argument is what The Matrix is based upon. That film, The Matrix, was actually written in consultation with philosophers who used Descartes' cave metaphor and Descartes' dream argument to help inform the way in which they would create this modern version of Descartes' dream argument. And the dream argument is basically pointing out a consequence of the new scientific method and this mind's eye model of perception. If all we perceive is our own thoughts, and we have no access to anything outside of our thoughts, then it's going to be very difficult to determine when our thoughts are real and when they're not real. You can watch the little video clip from The Matrix. We'll talk more about the setup of that film a little bit later. It's not necessary that you have seen the film, but it's a good example of a contemporary version of Descartes' dream argument. So a good way of understanding the basic principle involved in the dream argument is something that Descartes talks about later in the sixth meditation, the phenomena of phantom limbs. You may be aware of the fact that oftentimes when people have their leg or their hand amputated, they often will experience itches or pains or sensations in the limb that they no longer have. And Descartes explains that by pointing out that if the mind's eye model is correct, your brain doesn't know what's going on in your foot. All it gets is the signal that comes up your nerve endings to the brain. Just in the same way that if you hook a microphone up to a speaker, the speaker doesn't know if the microphone is really there or not. It doesn't know whether it's live or whether it's recorded. All the speaker gets is the signal that's coming into it, which reproduces the sound that was in the microphone. In the same way, the brain doesn't know whether there's a foot there or not. It just gets the signal that's coming to it from the nerve endings. So if something could spontaneously cause that same signal, then the brain would interpret it as an itch in the foot that was no longer there, just in the same way that if the speaker gets a recorded signal, it will play back exactly the same music. The basic principle is the speaker only gets the signal. It doesn't know whether anything's really there or not. So in the same way, the mind's eye model says the brain only gets the signal from the body, from the nerve endings. It doesn't know whether there's anything there or not. So because of that, radio and TV used to be only live. There had to be somebody actually playing into a microphone at the other end. If you wanted to listen to Duke Ellington playing in the Cotton Club on Saturday night in the 1920s, Duke Ellington actually had to be playing live in the Cotton Club to send the signal over the microphone to then be broadcast to the radio. If you wanted to watch TV in the 50s and watch the Milton Berle show or whatever the early shows were, it actually was live, and he actually had to be in the studio with the cameras in front of them. But people very quickly recognized, since the TV or the speaker doesn't get anything but the signal, it doesn't know whether Duke Ellington or the actors are really there. If you could find a way of recording that signal on magnetic tape or some other medium, and then play back exactly the same electronic signal that the radio is getting or that your TV is getting, your radio and your TV won't know the difference. They'll play back exactly the same sound or exactly the same images as if the people were live. The film Total Recall is sort of the brain version of that. It's like the contemporary version of Descartes' dream argument that is called the brain in the vat argument. In this case, our brain doesn't know what's outside of it. It only gets signals from the body. So if we were to record all of the signals that were going from your body to your brain and store them in a computer, we could take your brain out of the body completely and store it in a vat of nutrient substances and connect it up to all this stored information. And just as the radio can't tell if it's recorded, the TV can't tell if it's a recorded broadcast, all it gets is the signal. So if your brain got those signals coming to it from a recording stored in a computer, you would have exactly those experiences. So in the movie Total Recall, they don't actually have to take your brain out of your body and store it in a vat. They found a way through this mechanism, as they will in the Matrix, of connecting up to your brain while it's still in the body. But what they did was record the signals going to a person's brain when they were on like vacation or doing some adventure. And then instead of you actually having to go on vacation and endanger yourself, you could just replay the signals from someone else's brain that they were getting from their body. And since your brain doesn't know the difference, it only gets the signals, you would have all of the experiences of having a nice beach vacation or climbing a mountain or water skiing, even though your body wasn't doing any of those things. So you can see that in some sense that's what a dream is. A dream is like a phantom body. If the phantom limb is just spontaneous signals causing your brain to get the same signals you would get from your foot, so you have the experience of your foot itching or in pain. So in a dream, somehow or other, we don't know why or how, the brain spontaneously generates, maybe from memories, maybe constructing some of its own, your brain spontaneously constructs signals or creates signals, and those signals are interpreted by your brain as realistic experiences. Again, because your brain doesn't know the difference. All it gets is the signals. It doesn't have any access to what's outside of you except through those signals. So if the mind were like that, if the mind's eye model were true, it would be like a closed room with no doors and windows. John Locke, the Enlightenment philosopher, who was a contemporary of Descartes, a British philosopher, said that the mind is like a closed closet with no doors and windows. And if that's all there was, if there were no doors and windows, no way of going out, and all you saw was a TV screen on one side of the room that had pictures of maybe a sidewalk and people walking back and forth, and you could see the weather and the seasons go by, you wouldn't know whether those images on that screen were really truly what was outside of the room or not. Of course, someone could do the same trick we've just mentioned. They could record that feed. If you've watched a crime movie, oftentimes what they'll do with the surveillance cameras, so that people won't see them breaking in and stealing things, they'll record the surveillance camera feed from like a day ago when nothing was happening, and then play that back. So when you were in the room watching it be fall or watching it rain outside, they could have recorded the signals on that screen and be playing them back. And you could be in space, or it could be a completely different day with different weather or different things happening, and they're just playing a recorded feed on their TV screen. So that's the basis of the question. We'll see. Could you tell whether you were dreaming, or could you tell whether you're in the Matrix? The fact that if the mind's eye model says all you perceive is the contents of your own mind, how can you tell whether the things outside of you are true or not? And of course, the Matrix has to be much more complicated than just this recorded experience. So far, we've just explained how, like in Total Recall, they could replay exactly the same experience that someone else had sent to their brain before, or replay exactly the same song that someone had sung, or the same TV show, and replay it. But now we realize that once we understand how the signals in a TV cause the various different pixels to light up, once we understand how signals to a speaker cause it to make certain sounds, in the 70s they constructed a Moog synthesizer which was able to create artificial sounds that weren't recorded from someone else. If you give it exactly the same signal as a dog barking or a cello playing or a trumpet blaring, it will produce exactly that sound, even though there was no trumpet or was no dog. We all now have little musical keyboards where we can play jingle bells with dog barks. They didn't have to line up dogs to bark in key to do that. Those aren't recordings. Those are completely artificially constructed sounds, because all we had to do was construct the right type of signal into the speaker and it would produce the sound. And the same things in video create CGI characters who were never recorded. They never were actors for those characters. Instead, they were completely artificially constructed. So obviously the Matrix isn't just playing back recordings of the real world. It's got an artificially constructed world of the same sort that we would have in CGI. And something else, of course, is going to be true about the Matrix. Here you can see a picture of the Matrix. The people are laying in these pods and being used as an energy source. And there's a wire going into the back of their head feeding them signals from the computer, which are signals just like they would be getting from their senses. And their brain interprets them as real experience. But it works in the same way that multiplayer video games work, because besides getting an experience of the world, they also make decisions and act, and everybody experiences the same world, and they interact with other people in these pods. Not through their physical bodies, but they interact sort of through the game, the way you would interact with other people if you were playing a multiplayer game over the internet. And for that to happen, not only is there a game server which is sending each of the players information about what's going on in the game, but each of the players has a joystick and is changing things and making decisions and doing things, and that sends signals, output signals from the brain back to the computer, and then the computer then changes the picture of the world that it's sending back to each of them. So you have this two-way with inputs and outputs, so that when I do something, everybody else sees me doing it, and we all perceive the same construction of reality. So the Matrix would just be this more complicated two-way constructed brain-in-a-vat signaling system. But the idea is the same as these simple examples. The question is, are we really islands of subjectivity? Are we absolute individuals trapped only in our own mind? So we're not asking what you might be tempted to ask. Could we really have, in this way, could we really have realistic CGI or realistic simulations? Could the Matrix really produce a world that was absolutely realistic? In the movie, there are glitches in the Matrix that make it so that it is not exactly the same. But we're not interested in whether it's possible to construct a realistic simulation. We're more interested in the question of could we tell. So for purposes of this question, we're actually going to be assuming that the simulation is perfect, that the signal that's being sent by the computer to our brain is exactly the same as we would be perceiving in the external world. Sort of in the same way as if there were a concert that had a digital feed going to the microphone, and you could hear it through the speakers as you were actually as it was actually being played in the concert. If we took you, to a half mile away and played exactly the same digital feed and played it on a 5-minute delay, would you be able to tell the difference if it wasn't actually going on? And obviously, since we're assuming that the signal is exactly the same, if all you had to go on was the sound coming out of the speaker, or if you're in that closed room with no doors and windows, if all you had to go on was the screen, then obviously you could never tell. So what we're asking is not whether you could tell based upon the screen. We're asking, do you have anything else but the screen to go on? Again, the way I've set it up, the only possible way that you could tell in that closed room with no doors and windows whether what the screen was showing you was true or not, would be to take a sledgehammer and bust a hole in the wall and stick your head out, and then you could compare the world you saw outside of the room to the image that you had inside the room. So what we're really asking is, do we have some extrasensory access to the external world? Do we have any other information about the world besides what we perceive from the signals that come to our brain? It may help to compare this to some other versions of this question. There are really three different versions of the question we're going to ask in the next debate. We're asking it, could we tell if we were in the matrix? And we're assuming it's a perfect matrix. So we're really asking, do we have some other type of extrasensory connection or vibe or feeling in the world? This was similar to the question we asked before when we talked about God's existence. We asked, does God make any difference to reality? So that if God went out of existence, somehow all of the beauty or all of the life of God would go out of the universe would go out of existence or would fade. So we asked, could we tell if God took a vacation or God went out of existence? That was the point of St. Thomas's fourth way from Gradations of Goodness, that in some sense God is like the soul of the universe that animates it and makes it beautiful. And if he were gone, even though all of our senses would still remain the same, something would be different. This was similar, you may remember, you don't remember if you're too young, when CDs first came out in the 80s. Some people didn't like them because they thought that even though they were digitally much more accurate than analog recording, somehow or other they sounded less warm, less emotional, that somehow or other some other access that we had to the emotion and the feeling of the music was absent. And I guess nowadays there are still some people who prefer the analog recordings and the actual discs. So the alternative way of asking this question is to imagine, and there are movies like this, just like there are movie versions of The Matrix. If, like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, if we abducted the person you love most in the world and replaced them with a perfectly lifelike android, an android like in Westworld, if you've seen that show, or like in the movie Blade Runner, where their bodies were synthetic biological bodies that felt exactly like a real body. In the movies, you can often tell when your loved one has been abducted and replaced by a doppelganger, because they don't know things that the person you know would have known. They act differently. Their personality isn't the same. But let's imagine that we could scan the person that you loved brain and replace all their memories so that they knew your secret handshake. They knew how to kiss you in that special way. They would whisper the same little sweet nothings in your ear. So we're assuming that this android would be exactly like the person that you loved in every physical characteristic. Even their pupils would dilate and they would give off the same pheromones and everything. So we're asking, would you be able to tell the difference? And in this case, it may help you understand what we're talking about in the Matrix case, because we might think, or at least we like to think, that you would be able to tell that we believe that the person's soul animates their body, and it isn't just a matter of the physical sensations you're getting from them. Somehow you sense, or you have a connection with their soul. We'd like to be able to tell if the person that we were kissing was really in pain or was so bored that they were balancing their checkbook or thinking about baseball in their head, even though they were acting very well. Just in the same way we had thought that traditional Christianity thought that there was a vibe that we would get from someone who really loved us, so that we would know that they really would accept our real self. So the existentialist or Descartes are going to say that you couldn't tell if you were in the Matrix, or if they replaced your lover by someone who was exactly identical on the outside and sent all the same signals to your brain. Whereas the opposing view is going to say, yes, you could tell because you have some extrasensory connection And some feeling that you normally get would be different if the android, even though it produced all the same physical sensations, really had no consciousness and no feelings whatsoever. During our debate, we're also going to ask whether it would matter or not if you could tell. In the movie, one of the characters says it wouldn't really matter if, as long as the steak was just as juicy and tasted just as good, um, it wouldn't really matter. And so he chooses to go back into the Matrix, even though he knows that it's not real, because he thinks it doesn't matter if all the sensations are the same. One way of seeing how it might matter would be asking, what would the person that you love think if you told them that you had to answer this question? No. If you told them, in philosophy class they asked us if I'd be able to tell if they kidnapped you and killed you and replaced you with a perfect duplicate android of you. And when they asked me that, I had to say no. Think of how your significant other would feel if that's the answer that you gave, or if you told them that. We've already seen that real love can't be based just upon feelings or properties that you get from that person. So what you'd be saying, if you said that you couldn't tell, would be that you didn't really love that person. You didn't really love their individuality or their uniqueness. You would just love the feelings that you were getting from them. And an android, if it produced the same feelings, would be exactly the same for you. So that may help understand what we mean when we say, could you tell if you were in the Matrix, just as you might think that there was some vague feeling, some other extrasensory feeling that you get from a loved one. So you might think that we have some other extrasensory or vague feeling or connection to the object. And we'll see what that would look like next time when we look at some of Descartes' arguments in the third meditation. So Descartes starts to crawl out of this hole that he's built for himself. At the end of the first meditation, he knows nothing. Everything that he might believe about the external world he discovers might be a dream, might be merely a simulation, because all he gets are the sensations and ideas that come from the signals to his brain, and he has no contact to the world outside of those signals. He's a radical individual, an island of subjectivity, completely trapped within his own mind. But the one thing that he can be certain of, the first sort of firm brick that he starts rebuilding the edifice of his knowledge upon, is his own existence. And it's not that he knows that he exists because he thinks. The famous Latin phrase is cogito, I think, ergo sum, or therefore. I am sum, which is I exist. So the reason he knows that he exists because he thinks isn't because in order to do anything you have to exist. So you could just as well say, like you see on some t-shirts, I drink, therefore I am, or I belch, therefore I am. Descartes realizes that that isn't the case. You don't know that your body exists. You could be dreaming. You could be a brain in a vat. You could be in the Matrix. So I drink, therefore I am, or I belch, therefore I am, doesn't work. The reason he can't be mistaken about his thought is because his thought he perceives directly inside the room. So if we go back to our closed closet or closed room metaphor, you could be certain of everything that was inside the room. In fact, you can be certain of what's on the screen and say, I see on the screen that it's raining, or I see on the screen that there's a tree. As long as you just say it's inside the room on the screen, you can't be mistaken. In the same way, Descartes thinks not only can you not be mistaken about your existence of this soul, this mind's eye that's doing the watching, but you can't be mistaken about any of your thoughts. What you are is a res cogitans, a thinking substance, and you can't be mistaken about any of your thoughts. If it feels to you like you're angry, if it feels to you like it seems as if it's raining, or it seems as if there's a person outside of you, or it seems as if there's an itch on your foot, you can't be mistaken about that seeming, about what you perceive directly on the inside of your mind. Of course, you can only be mistaken when you then try to apply it to the external world and say the pictures you have inside your mind really are true of the things that exist outside of your mind. So the soul or the self is this island of subjectivity, which is a thinking thing, a res cogitans, or a thinking substance, and it exists in a different ghostly way than your body exists. Descartes is going to think that science is completely true of the body. It's an extended thing. It only has primary properties. It's dead and lifeless matter. It has no feelings. It has no internal nature. It's just the primary properties. To see how seriously he took this, he thought our body was a machine. He thought that animals, for example, were not really conscious creatures. They were just very complex automata. He thought there would be nothing wrong with torturing your cat, because literally he thought your cat was a robot. He thought that it had no feelings or consciousness. It was just because it didn't use language, he had no evidence that it had a soul. So he thought it was just a very complicated machine. So he thought that human beings were radically dualistic creatures. We were unextended minds that existed with ghostly substance, or res cogitans, that were inhabiting and operating kind of by remote control a mechanistic body, which was just a complex machine that had muscles and nerves extending into it that allowed it to act. So Descartes' view, he didn't call it this, but the 20th century philosopher Gilbert Ryle gave it this name, which is stuck to Descartes' substance dualism. He called it the ghost in the machine view. The ghost is like the soul that is controlling the body by remote control. And just like if you were controlling a robot on Mars, or the lunar lander by remote control, you would be in the base in Cape Canaveral or wherever, and you would be watching and getting inputs from the robot. So the robot gets inputs on the screen that the ghost can watch and sees what the robot is doing. And then the robot controls the joystick and sends signals to the machine or to the robot to guide its actions. So Descartes thought that the soul was like a ghostly entity that was getting inputs from the senses and perceiving these ideas, and then was controlling our body like a remote control robot. He actually thought that the pineal gland, which is a gland in the top center of our brain, we now know it is involved in regulating cycles and hormones and things like that. But Descartes had no idea what it was, and he hypothesized that it was sort of the grand central panel where the ghost controlled the brain and where the brain sent signals to the ghost. So this way of splitting up the mind and the body was Descartes' way of reconciling science and religion, which is sort of his main aim. You've got these two different types of reality, physical substance, and science is completely true of that. It's dead, lifeless matter, following only the laws of physics. But then you had this mental substance, this res cogitans, and religious truth could be about that. It had free will, it had feelings, it had values. And we'll see that this is going to be important for us in the course, because this is the first real argument that we've seen that subjectivity is more real than science, that subjectivity is more real than objectivity. We had seen in St. Thomas's arguments that there were exceptions to objectivity in the transcendental arguments, things that science couldn't explain. But Descartes is saying, for the mind and for mental substance, I can be more certain of my mind subjectively than I can ever be of anything that science tells me from the outside. He hasn't yet rebuilt up his scientific knowledge. We'll see how he gets to it in the third meditation and the fifth and sixth meditation. But Descartes is more certain of his mind than he is of his body. So he's going to disagree with science on the mind, whereas he'll still agree with objectivity or science on the body. For things that we can't feel from the inside, science or objectivity is still going to be the best way to go. So we'll see in Meditation 3 how Descartes is going to get out of his mind and what it would mean to have some other access to the world outside of our senses, which is what we're really asking when we ask, could you tell if you were in the Matrix?